The internet is filled with stories about people who clip out of reality and into somewhere else. Terms like backrooms, states, woods are common on Reddit. And I'm not here to argue semantics with you. I call them fairy pockets, but even that is just a term I made up, so use what you like. There are no word police. Not that I have found yet. There are no set rules by which one enters a fairy pocket. Sometimes you just slip in by accident, though there's usually an easy way out, if you know what to look for. Something that will just not look right and help you pull yourself back to reality. It's hard to explain. My job is that I find them, go into them, and figure out what, if anything, is valuable there, and then sell that information to governments or private businesses. You would be shocked at the amount of natural resources some of these places hold. I can assure you that the Iraq War was not about oil without a shadow of a doubt, but they're always dangerous, so it's a tough call on whether or not they're worth it, and, thank God, not mine to make. Usually you can find some idiots willing to buy your dangerous claim for at least enough to break even, unless it's Rockport. Nobody even tries to claim that God-forsaken place anymore. Today I'm just going to tell you about a few places I found, and then, if there are any questions, I'll try and answer them. So without further ado, let's start with Pittsburgh's Infinite City. There is this one place in downtown Pittsburgh about 2 blocks from the old U.S. Steel building, where if you follow a complicated set of turns and steps, which I can't disclose due to an NDA, you will find yourself in a near-endless, entirely abandoned cityscape of almost identical brick tenements. It, as far as I could tell, served no real practical use to the people I sold it to, but mine is not to reason why. They paid well, and I don't question money on general principle. That said, the thing that struck me as most strange about this place wasn't how empty it was or who built it, being a total mystery. I always have assumed something built these places. No, the strangest part of this was that every single sign or any other piece of writing I could find in this city was written in what I eventually identified as a 14th century dialect of Polish. That's a nice and simple one, not really scary. Though I confess, all those empty buildings did get eerie. But most of the things I find are like that, a little off-putting perhaps, but not anything special. And this memoir is dedicated more to my horrific experiences. After all, they're the ones that make for good stories. Now, some places like that feel creepy, but are fine. Others, like what we'll talk about next, feel fine but are potentially dangerous. If you've ever taken a road trip through Kansas, you'll know how flat it is, but perhaps one or two of you, while driving, have thought you saw a mountain way off in the distance. You probably stopped and shook your head, maybe rubbed your eyes, and it was gone. Good. It doesn't exist and it can't hurt you, unless you drive exactly 4 miles over the speed limit for 20 minutes while staring at the mountain. Then take a sharp left onto a dirt road between 2 cornfields with a wooden sign on an archway over it. The sign may or may not say anything. That tends to change for some reason. The dirt farm road will soon turn into a paved highway, and you will be in Haskam County. It's a nice place if you don't mind the smell of sulfur. It's a geothermal hotspot, and the entire place stinks of eggs. The locals are nice, hard-working folks who will give you the shirt off their back, and really are fine people. But take my advice and don't go to any of the churches in the county. They all have the same preacher who tells the same sermon every week, like a recording. And the people can get violent if you ever look bored during it. Other than that, it's a great place to live, with property values that can't be beat, on account of the fact that I am fairly certain it's still 1973 there. A few hundred miles away, there's one place in the Midwest. Again, for legal reasons, I can't tell exactly how to find. What I can tell is that it's a small regional airport in a big-ish city. That's all I can say. The vending machines all sell products that aren't in business anymore, but I am not entirely sure if that's supernatural or just some strange gimmick on the part of the airport management. What is weird is that if you walk into one specific woman's bathroom on a Tuesday, there will be an elevator at the far end of the room, past the last sink. It takes you up through 99 floors, 98 of which are identical open-plan office space. You cannot see the skyscraper from outside the airport, and actually, Some planes fly right through where it should be. Every floor is the same, laid out in long rows of desks with big box computers and off-white landline phones with wood grain siding, each station manned by workers dressed in business casual, talking on phones and generally doing what you'd expect from a call center. The only issue is that they are speaking exclusively in dead languages: Latin, Proto-Finnic, Occitan. I even heard some Akkadian when I was there. Honestly, it's the most well-managed office I've ever seen. Everyone works hard, and nothing ever goes majorly wrong, which I suspect has something to do with the fact that as far as I could tell, there were no managers to screw things up. I went up to floor 99, but decided against floor 100. You see, 99 was a waiting room, like you'd find at a doctor's office, and to access floor 100, you had to take the stairs. The sounds coming from up there cannot be described, and I do mean cannot. I have tried repeatedly, and it only leads to me having a seizure. Not wanting to repeat that, I will leave them to your imagination. A buddy of mine who is a priest suggested that I had found purgatory, and perhaps he was right. I'm no theologian, so I'll leave that one to the church. There is an area in San Francisco where you can see what I think is Atlantis, where Alcatraz should be, but I haven't figured out how to get there yet, and there is a way to get to the moon from Houston without NASA being involved. But by far the weirdest fairy pocket I ever found was Mount Prince Nelson National Park in West Virginia. It's a beautiful place, by the way, wonderful hiking, and some absolutely stunning views of the mountains. But I don't recommend you take your kids. It is by far the most dangerous place I have ever been, and I lived in Chicago for 3 months. Long story, I was trying to figure out where all the damn clowns kept coming from. But I digress. Mount Prince Nelson is about 700 square miles, located within an area of West Virginia no larger than a Walmart parking lot, which coincidentally is how you get there. Follow the steps correctly, and where the main doors are, a stone arch will appear with an NPS ranger who charges you 42 cents as an entry fee, and hands you a waiver to sign in the reasonably likely event that you die in the park. There are miles and miles of roads, both paved and unpaved, and a core area around a lake that contains the majority of the tourist stuff. It's more or less safe on account of the National Park Service maintaining a round-the-clock watch on the perimeter that would make the Marines look sloppy, and the flight of F-14 Eagle fighter jets flying 24/7 hot laps around the area is a great comfort. But we weren't paid to be comfortable, and our bosses wanted us deeper in the park and off-trail. Once you get outside of the patrolled area like we were, things take a turn. Everything, and I do mean everything, wants to kill you. There are beetles, the insect, the size of beetle, the car, for starters. The cool part, however, is the dinosaurs that roam free in the park. Side note, that whole "they can't see you if you don't move" thing is bull. Ask me how I know. It's a rainforest, so the backwoods camping isn't easy, because hacking your way off trail is a nightmare even without the venomous trees and psychic frogs. But I have to say, it really is beautiful, puts Yellowstone to shame on a bad day, and that's saying it mildly. When I first went to Mount Prince Nelson, I was part of a team of specialists called in by the National Park Service to figure out why they kept getting paperwork from their employees there despite no knowledge of it existing. We spent about 6 months figuring out how to get in, and that's when things started to go badly wrong. Our team lead, an older guy named Donald, was the first to die. He had taken watch around our camp on the first night after we left the safe zone, and some kind of big ape-looking thing came out of the woods and attacked. Beat poor Donnie half to death before we were able to kill it, and he was dead by the time we got him back to a ranger station for medevac. We had a job to do, and the pay was good, so we pushed on, deeper into the woods, where the 9 surviving men of our team got knocked down to 5 on the 3rd day by some kind of screaming fog, though all things considered, it wasn't so bad, as it also killed the T-Rex that was chasing us. Jacoby, one of the newbies, went nuts that night and started talking about how he had communed with a goddess at the center of the mountain in his sleep, and that he needed to go out and join her amidst the rocks, lest all reality be consumed. I had to put him down with my 45 before the crazy spread to the rest of the team, which might be my least favorite part of this damn job. The remaining 4 of us found an old cabin nearby and decided to hold up for the night. By the next morning, we were down to 3. I hadn't gotten to Jacoby in time, I guess. We reached the decision that we were going to try and make our way back to the safe zone after a short debate. I always try to be democratic where possible. So we started back. When we had been walking for around 7 hours, Rodriguez, who was on point, signaled a halt. He said he thought he had heard a twig breaking about 100 yards to our right. He was right, to worse luck. If he hadn't stopped, maybe that prick wouldn't have been able to line up his shot. The arrow took Rodriguez in the chest, sending him to the ground. Me and O'Leary opened up with our weapons in the direction of the archer, but I don't think we hit him. Rodriguez would have survived had the arrow not been poisoned, but he was already turning green and bleeding from his eyes by the time I got the bandage over the wound. I gave him last rites by sticking a stake through his heart and zip-tying across to his right hand so he wouldn't come back as anything unnatural. Then the 2 of us left and set off again in the direction of home. O'Leary and I made it a long way that day without stopping and ended up camping close enough to the safe zone that we were fairly confident in making it there the next day. I took first watch and chewed coffee grounds to stay awake, as I had no doubts that we were still being hunted. The attack came sometime around 0:30, when I got a feeling on the back of my neck that I was being watched. I have learned to listen to these feelings, and it's why I'm still alive. Diving for the ground, the arrow just narrowly missed me, slamming into a tree a few yards behind. O'Leary was awake now and scrambling for his rifle while I fired blindly into the trees from cover. We were unlikely to make it back without getting rid of this hunter, so I signaled for him to cover me as I crawled away from our camp. It took about 10 minutes or so before I found his tracks. 2 muddy boot prints and a Snickers wrapper gave away where he had been standing, and a trail of greenish-blue blood leading away from the spot told me one of us had hit the bastard. O'Leary and I stalked him for about half a mile before we found him collapsed by a creek bed, panting heavily. A handsome young man dressed in bright orange hunting gear. The only sign he wasn't human was the metallic red hair and his almost neon green eyes. He cussed me out in what might have been an early ancestor of Welsh before O'Leary blew his brains all over the forest floor. I wasn't sure that would stop him for long, so just to be safe, I hogtied him before we left. O'Leary quit this job after we made it back to civilization. I can't blame him. The last I heard, he had become a Buddhist monk and lived up some mountain in Colorado. I just hoped it wasn't anywhere near Rockport. That is one pocket that even I won't go to. But the pay from the National Park Service was more than enough for me to retire on, had I wanted to. So there are certainly perks to this job. Why do I still do it? I would love to get philosophical, but frankly, I just like it. It tickles the part of the human spirit that first pushed man to sail across oceans or fly to the moon. And like those great explorers of the past, I'm not sure if I could stop even if I wanted to. It has its hooks in me and won't let go. I have other stories, of course, might even post them later, but these were a few that stood out to me. I will try to answer any questions, but given the number of NDAs and ancient blood oaths I've had to sign over the years, I make no promises about how much I can deliver. That said, if this job sounds fun to you, or the money sounds like a great way to get rich quick, I really do not recommend you take it up. People like that don't tend to last long. And for the love of all that is holy, if you are in Colorado and see a sign for a town called Rockport, turn around. Last time I broke down a few of the places I'd seen, so today I've got a few more. One time I was in Europe on a business trip and found a bridge in a rural area east of Berlin that only appeared under a full moon. When I found it, it was guarded by soldiers in World War II-era uniforms, but from asking the locals about it, I gathered that sometimes they would be dressed as NVA troops, or Franco-Prussian war troops, or medieval knights. Not sure what variable dictated the time period. The weirdest part was that they didn't speak German, instead speaking a language I never could identify. They'll ask for your papers, but accept anything you show them. They mean you no harm. Though what they are really, I'm not sure. I can't explain it, but I got a pretty strong feeling they weren't human. Another time I was in Florida, and I found a restaurant in the middle of the Everglades. A clean, well-kept little cafe, dead in the middle of a swamp, with no way of accessing it. Stepping inside, I was greeted by a middle-aged lady with a funny accent who told me the daily specials in broken English. They were bizarre things, cow eyes fried in butter or teriyaki rats. I posed as a health inspector, and shockingly, the kitchen was very clean. Still didn't eat anything, though. Sup not of the fairy, they say. Or maybe I'm just too chicken to try weird swamp teriyaki. Now for the last one today, I warn you. This place was awful even by my standards. I won't tell you how to get in, not because of any legal restrictions this time, but because I really don't want any of you going to this place and getting killed. The entrance was a highway tunnel built into the side of a rise in the Pine Barrens. I'll tell you that much, because it won't give you a hint how to make it appear. Follow it about 10 miles into the ground and you'll come to a parking lot, like one of the multi-level car parks you find in big cities. Find a parking spot and take care to park legally. The traffic cops down there are seriously jackbooted. I mean TSA with a toothache kind of mean. Then walk to an elevator in the center of the garage and take it down. Congratulations, you have just entered hell. The sign by the door reads Pine Rock Mall, with a picture of a Greek comedy mask grinning next to it. But I'm sure they just misspelled hell. Easy mistake for something made of solid madness and screaming eyes, I'm sure. Oh, it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. Doesn't hold a candle to those clowns in Chicago. And it's certainly no Rockport. But it was not something I would wish on my worst enemy. It was a perfectly normal shopping mall, probably built somewhere around the late 70s or early 80s, at least in appearance. A bit large, but nothing out of the ordinary. Abandoned, but in good enough condition to restore. No leaks or flooding, and the power was still on. Lights flickered faintly, and as I wandered the halls, scratchy speakers played a loop of Aretha's Respect. Just the chorus in a painful-sounding twisted loop like the tape was melting. And an announcement in a chipper voice that the Pine Rock Mall is eternally blessed by your presence. Remember to shop excitedly. Spoken in a strange cadence like the speaker didn't know the language they were using. Everything was still pretty normal though, except for the stores. All abandoned, but they ranged from odd antique baby dolls and knives were the only things in one shop, to the wrong. Another was full of cages like a pet store, but there were human bones in the cages, and all the signage said it had been a slave market. Yeah, you read that right. To the pure evil, a video shop like Blockbuster that seemed to carry nothing but videos of people dying. Still, it was all abandoned, suddenly abandoned by the looks of it, like that city in Ukraine that was evacuated after Chernobyl. Things were left sitting around as if everyone had just gotten up midday and walked out. Like I'd missed the rapture, except with what these stores sold. There was no doubt these customers were not raptured. Smited, perhaps. Still, so far you probably wonder why I said this place was so bad. After all I've described is a lot of evil shops. Big deal, right? Just go to a bad part of New York and you'll find worse. Well, maybe not a slave market, openly, but you get my point. Now, as I slowly made my way through the empty concourses, I was actually glad that this place wasn't any worse than abandoned evil. I mean, there are places where the ground has teeth, and the sky screams in colors beyond the mind. The slave trade is nothing compared to the madness of gibbering gods beyond the concept of time. But then I reached the Central Plaza. You know how some malls have a hotel built into them? It was more of a thing in the 80s, but you see it from time to time. A nice hotel rising like a middle finger pointed at heaven from the temple of consumerism below. As if a building that let you eat, buy a TV, and get a cheap suit without stepping outside was worth spending a day or two in it. Alright, maybe I'm a little, scratch that, a lot jaded, but I still never understood that architectural trend. Well, this was one of those malls, roughly cross-shaped, with 4 big concourses coming off of a central plaza that went up about 17 stories, with hotel balconies looking down on you. Now picture, if you will, that arrangement with a fountain at the center of the plaza. A nice water feature that teenagers would congregate around in a normal mall. Now replace that water feature with an elaborately decorated hole in the ground and you're getting close. It was a pit about 20 by 20 feet, with a raised lip around it, decorated with a pattern of theater masks done in small tile mosaic, and from it was imitating a smell like death had died and started to rot. I pulled the gas mask from my belt and stepped the edge, wondering what had gone wrong in my life to lead to this point. I played a spotlight into the pit and will try to describe what I saw at the bottom. A soup of liquid flesh, boiled below me with eyes and mouths rising to the surface like bubbles popping with a sound like a mating cougar crossed with a badly maintained piece of industrial equipment, splashing as if churned by some force below its surface and stinking so bad I wanted to puke through the mask. That is a bad, cartoonish, and mostly unhelpful description, but it really is the best I can give. Now the hypothetical you, Mr. Random, who has wandered into this place by sheer accident and colossally bad luck would, being a sensible person, run, possibly screaming like a little girl, as fast as you can in the opposite direction. You are a smart, sane, and well-adjusted person. I, however, get paid to poke cosmic bears for a living, so I'll give you 3 guesses what I did, and the first 2 don't count. Yeah, that's right. I, God help me, tossed a coin into the well. Actually, it was a glow stick. I digress. It hit the surface with a weird metallic sound and a splash, and that is when all hell broke loose. The masks all around the building, carved into the artistic bits of walls and floors, all began to laugh hysterically. The liquid flesh quickly bubbled to the surface, and at that moment I ran, turning once to see it pouring over the lip of the well, screaming in a dozen languages, telling me everything I'd ever done wrong. As I ran, it followed behind me like a tsunami of screaming meat. Unfathomable in how wrong it was, yet somehow alluring, it made me want to turn and look at it. I didn't. Sloshing and screaming, it filled the floor quickly, and by the time I reached the elevator, it was already biting my shoes, hairy teeth pulling strips of rubber from my soles. I climbed up the elevator cables as I doubted it would work with that stuff pouring in, and made it to my car just inches ahead of the wave. I peeled out of the parking lot and shot into the woods of the Pine Barrens like a wine cork. The tunnel entrance behind me was closing to chew. I'll be quite honest with you, I don't even know how to end this one, other than to warn you against trying to find that place, though if you did try and find it, that would be natural selection at work. But there'll be other stories coming, assuming I don't die too soon. There are more weird things in this world than you'd ever know. By the way, sorry to anyone who has been seeing men in suits after reading my last couple posts. Don't worry, you're not crazy. They are actually after you. In my first post, I made a throwaway remark about how there are no word police, and that technically is true. But there certainly are entities of the federal government who will come after you if you talk about this stuff. How can I get away with it? Easy, nobody believes anything posted on Reddit. It's psychically impossible for 93% of humans. My theory is that the site was cursed using ancient Tokarian blood magic. I bring up the feds now because they are somewhat important to this story, specifically the Department for the Containment of Dangerous Truths. If it sounds Orwellian, it is. Orwellian, oppressive, unconstitutional, and necessary. There are things out there that we, by which I mean the collective masses of the human race, really don't want a lot of people knowing about. If, let's say, hypothetically, a town in Michigan starts worshipping something in a fairy pocket, something that will awaken from its dreaming death when the stars align, then the merciless eradication of the town and its people is sometimes the merciful thing to do. That said, I'm not here to sing their praises. In fact, I don't like them. They're self-important black-budget, spooky, glowy asshats, and they often make my life very hard, such as the time I was on the 103rd floor of the Empire State Building, being swarmed by demonic pigeons, and they threatened to fine me if I killed any of the fanged, fire-breathing hellspawn. Apparently, they're an endangered species. Or the time I watched them napalm a hippie commune in Nova Scotia for being in league with extra-dimensional forces. They were not. Apparently, the DCDT never learned that hippie losers on LSD talk about communing with nature goddesses that speak through Beatles songs all the time, and that is not, in fact, a sign they're being puppeteered by the great old ones. Unless their name is Charlie, then you might want to watch out. I'm sure you all are here for the story about the clowns, which I had previously said I wouldn't tell. But on reflection, I think it's necessary. Don't think this means you are ever going to get Rockport. You don't want to know about that town, you don't need to know about that town, and you won't learn about that town from me. But before we get to the clowns, there are a few other small stories I figured I'd add in, since I received feedback that my last post was too short. If that was all you thought about after reading my mall story, are you okay? So first let me tell you about the first time I ever had the pleasure of meeting agents of the DCDT. I was new to the job, only had it about a month at this point. Old Jed, the man who got me into this line of work, somewhere between a father and a worst enemy to me, had brought me along to survey a forest in Death Valley that appeared during certain phases of the moon. There was some evidence it might contain uranium deposits close to the surface that would be valuable to the right customer. So we spend days in Death Valley wearing radiation suits. Trust me, whatever's going on in your life, it could be worse. It didn't. By the way, the trees were just radioactive, but what it did contain was a small settlement inhabited by an inbred semi-feral tribe of mutants. I'd say the hills have eyes, but these folks were mostly blind. However, this story isn't going where you probably expect. They were actually quite friendly. My first thought on seeing their misshapen forms lumbering through the trees was to shoot. But Jed stayed in my hand, and quietly we approached. We observed them from a distance for a while. Jed was something of an amateur anthropologist, where the various denizens of the fairy pockets were concerned, and would often write articles for Exploration Quarterly and the Esoteric Review. What you haven't heard of them, don't think those are real publications. I guess you know every niche industry journal for obscure career paths then. He was like a kid in a candy store, taking notes and sketching them. I was hot. After a couple days, he finally had enough for a paper and we left the pocket. Immediately he radioed our employer, who called the feds to report what we'd found in accordance with federal law. We thought nothing more after that. Until we were about halfway back to where we parked our car when the black helicopter boys arrived. It was one of the direct response containment teams. In other words, DCDT's SWAT. Though calling them a death squad might be more accurate. They rappelled down from their choppers, all dressed in black and waving around guns that were about 50 years ahead of what the army had. I've always suspected some kind of multi-dimensional Iran-Contra thing, but that's one bear I chose not to poke. Once they were on the ground, pointing those futuristic-looking guns at us for no apparent reason, their leader, a man I chose to call Fluffy because it would probably annoy him, demanded really, that we show them back to the forest. But as a few days had passed and the moon wasn't in position anymore, we told him he was out of luck. It'd be a full year before anyone could get back in there again. He scowled and snapped his fingers, at which point one of his goons pulled something like a crystal that seemed to glow darkness, if that makes any sense. I can't really describe it, from his pocket. Just being near it made my teeth hurt and gave me the sense that something was watching me for days afterward, and wave it in the direction of where the forest had been. Sure enough, it rematerialized. Side note, a tool that could force fairy pockets to appear would make my life so much easier, but something about that thing just screamed evil, and I'm glad I have never seen it again. We put back on our radiation suits and led them to the edge of the forest. Despite our warnings about the dangerous radiation levels, they insisted we lead them to the settlement, and we relented. I mean, what do I care if they get cancer? If you tell a man about the dangers of smoking and he does it anyway, that's on him, right? Well, the same goes for walking into forests of radioactive trees as far as I'm concerned. I didn't really know what was going on at the time, but I could tell Jed was put out about the whole thing. He has a real begrudging attitude towards them the entire way back to the settlement. When we got there, I realized why. They didn't hesitate, just raised their guns and started shooting. The entire population was wiped out in under 7 minutes of mechanically precise violence. I was stunned. Honestly, I was something stronger than stunned, but I don't think words exist for the feeling in English. These people had been freaks, sure, but they weren't hurting anyone. Hell, they couldn't except for a few days out of the year even if they wanted to. And with hardly a word, these monsters had massacred them. I tried to punch Fluffy then and there and was only saved from making that mistake by Jed grabbing my arm and pinning me against a tree. As soon as the deed was done, they left and I turned to Jed demanding answers. He explained how things really work, why some awful things need to happen, and how we should just be glad we don't have to do it. I didn't believe him at the time, thought he was just being a coward. Suffice it to say, I've seen enough since then. I've realized he was right. To put things in perspective, their unofficial motto is, "Great Cthulhu sleeps, we don't." It really says it all. Jed will come up again from time to time in these stories. He plays a very important role in many of my early explorations. I miss that old bastard. Anyway, another interesting story for you is the time I was in Boston back about 10, maybe 15 years ago. That city is lousy with fairy pockets, I mean infested. Revolutionary battlefields hidden in Chinese restaurants, mad realms of gibbering flesh behind dumpsters, but most are fairly inoffensive by virtue of the fact that people only rarely fall in. Again, every pocket has specific conditions which have to be met to get in, and most people will never do the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time in their life. This one was different. A large upscale department store was having a problem with retaining staff, and I don't mean because they were quitting. They were vanishing into thin air at an alarming rate. Well, I guess anyone vanishing into thin air would be alarming to most people. But you get what I mean, so that's why I got called in. And as it turned out, they weren't vanishing into thin air. Rather, they were vanishing into the janitor's closet next to the loading dock, which staff had been using for years as a place to sneak off and smoke. But as it became clear almost at once, something had changed, because now they weren't coming out. So I did the first thing that came to mind. I walked into the closet, sat on the upturned bucket, and lit one of Marlboro's finest. Nothing. Next, I tried wearing the employee uniform, trying other common brands of tobacco. All I got was a sore throat and a sore butt from sitting on that bucket. I started treating this like a murder mystery, looking into all the missing people and trying to find any connection between them, trying to build a profile. All one race? Nope. Same age range? Nah. What about religion? Nada. I was getting annoyed after a couple of days when I saw it. They were all hired on a Tuesday. I checked with the company and sure enough, their HR department had always conducted interviews on Monday, until a few months earlier when their old HR manager had retired, and the new guy wanted to hold the meetings on Tuesdays. Yet turns out the way into that pocket was to make $19.73 an hour, be hired on a Tuesday, and smoke while sitting on a bucket within about half a square mile in downtown Boston. That's not even the weirdest set of rules I've ever seen, but it gives a good picture of what I do to get into these places, which I have somewhat neglected in my previous stories. As for the employees, they were dead, already absorbed by the flesh pillar. I got out as soon as I saw there was no saving them. Now for the thing I've been hinting at all day, the clown story. Where do I begin? I suppose background context is probably the best place. Chicago, as I'm sure many of you know, is not the safest city. But even in far more dangerous cities, if the police were suddenly receiving reports of specific types of crime over 200 times more often, they'd realize something was up. So it was when Chicago's rate of missing children jumped from a handful of cases a week to hundreds. The FBI took one look at the case and called in the DCDT. They spent several months and more taxpayer money than I care to guess at deciding that they couldn't figure out what was going on and went home. Then the city government reached out to me. A gentleman doesn't kiss and tell, neither does a professional get paid and tell, but suffice to say I made enough to be happy for a while off the contract. So I started by going through all the paperwork the police had about the situation. It was a lot of dead trees for little result, but I at least came away with the certainty that something weird was legit happening here. It took a couple months to figure out what was going on, and I won't bore you with the details of my investigation, but it led me to Boingo's Big Top Bonanza, a fairy pocket that contained only one local inhabitant, Boingo the Clown. You see old Boingo, and old is right. Best I could tell from the records, he had been coming out of his pocket to take kids every 50 years or so as long as Chicago had been a city. When I found out how to get in, I made a mistake. While I called the DCDT and told them to send a team, I decided to go in alone. Once I arrived in the pocket, there was a large gate in front of me shaped like a grinning clown's mouth. Beyond it, the grounds of a circus, all lit up and popping calliope music, but without a person in sight. On the clown's teeth were letters spelling out, "Now the fun starts." I could tell right away fun would not be part of the equation. The air was humid and thick, stinking in a way you really can't picture without having smelled it. It was like a mix of bad cologne and sugar, trying and failing to hide the stench of rotting meat. The piping music and the flashing lights combined with the smell to make for an extremely disorientating effect. And as I crossed the grounds to the main tent, I felt as if I was walking without getting any closer. An illusion, I think, as I did eventually reach the tent. Standing outside the entrance to the tent, a new sound could be heard under the eerie calliope music piping around the thick air. The sounds of a children's party, laughing, yelling, fragments of conversation, and the clicking sounds of people eating and drinking from plastic plates and cups, all with a manic energy that seemed somehow sad in its faux happiness. I didn't go in, not by the front door. Instead, I crept around until I found a back entrance, and after checking my surroundings, I slipped in. I want you to picture a medieval feast. Now mix that mental image with a kid's birthday party, and that's what I saw. Kids ranging in age from 5 to 12 sat at long tables laughing and talking and eating piles of cakes and candies, shoving them in with pure gluttony, all wearing wide fixed grins bellow blank eyes that all seemed to glow an almost luminescent green. And above them, on a raised dais, sitting on a bright technicolor throne, was the grossest, fattest man I have ever seen. The folds of his gut hung from the sides of the throne like curtains, and spilled out from under an overstretched polka-dot shirt like a bag of worms. His skin wasn't a natural white, but truly white as if it had been painted, which, in truth, I suppose it had, as he was a vast and vile clown. He watched over the partying children with calculating eyes as if he were looking for something, and to my horror, I soon learned what. As I watched, he raised a vast, soft hand, and the tent fell silent with the eyes of all the children on their jester king. When he spoke, the high-pitched voice seemed muffled and wet as it escaped his wobbling lips. "Bring me Braden." Suddenly, the children exploded into movement as at least a dozen of them grabbed one of the older kids and wrestled him, screaming to the front of the room where the clown seemed to examine him with a keen eye. I recognized him. He was one of the first kids to go missing almost 6 months earlier. "Yes, he will do," the clown spoke like a businessman, approving absently of a wine before a meal meant to impress, more than taste good. Then the other kids were forcing Braden to his feet and into the clown's vast arms. With surprising strength, the clown lifted the boy, kicking and screaming now in terror, and sniffed at his hair. It didn't take a genius to guess what came next, and I looked away as I heard the awful squelching and crunching noises. Slowly I crept back out of the tent and decided to leave. There was nothing I could do, nothing except wait for the DCDT agents to come and deal with this. And come they did, bursting through the gates in full tactical regalia as I sat stunned and sickened by the giant mouth. I was not surprised to see it was Fluffy's team. I had crossed paths with them semi-frequently, still do, though Fluffy is either dead, promoted, or retired, as I haven't seen him in years. Without a word, they brushed past me, then the shooting started. It went on for what felt like hours, though I know it was less than a minute. There was an initial roar of gunfire and screams, then a tremendous blast as something exploded, and the horrid smell grew worse, washing out from the tent. Soon the sound was dying down to a few sporadic cries of pain, cries that invariably would be followed by a single shot, then silence. As the DRCT men exited the big top, I saw their unadorned black armor was painted red with fresh blood. Not thinking of my own safety, I staggered up to Fluffy, cussing him out and demanding an explanation as to why they had killed all the children. His men were all pointing guns at me as I stood before him, shouting, but I didn't care. I was outraged, infuriated. Their eyes were green, he said in a cold, distant voice. They'd already eaten his food. They weren't people, not anymore. Then we signaled to one of his men, who pulled something from his pocket and pressed a button, and like that, they were gone, faded into thin air with a sound like tearing leather. The worst part is that I knew he was right. Sup not of the fairy. And those kids had done more than sup. They had feasted down to the dregs. Whatever humanity they'd once had was long gone before their eyes turned green. I knew that. But still, it hurt. I have many issues with the DCDT. But one thing I can't deny is that they do things I know need done, and know more than I could ever do. Call me a hypocrite, but at least I'm honest. Not having whatever tech they used, it was harder for me to leave. But eventually I found myself back in Chicago. I was paid well for my work and was given the keys to the city in secret, but I've never come closer to quitting my job than I did then. I did quit it for all of 2 months, but as I've said before, I'm an addict, and try as I might, I can't quit.